Mali from Qom, Dr. Komail Rajani from Exeter, Dr. Ali Raza Bhojani from Loughborough, Sheikh Abu Ja'far from Birmingham, and in the latter part of the discussion, we will be joined by Sister Berak Hussain from Toronto. The topic for discussion on this night is Azadari and symbolism. Now, straight off, I would like to ask, and we will start with Dr. Bhojani. What do we understand by Azadari and symbolism within Shia Islam?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I think symbolism we can think of more generally, first and foremost, before we come to Shia Islam. Symbolism is a part of human life, actually, a part of every human interaction. Even at some level, the very language that we use is a type of symbolism. We use language to represent something which we intend. Okay, and language is useful, as a means of communication, of taking us towards something else. So we use the word, whatever it may be, table, to bring to mind, the piece of furniture which sits in front of me. And symbols at some level are so intertwined in the way that we do in a very, very ordinary manner that we take them for granted. Now, of course, when it comes to religious practice and religious culture even, we see different levels of symbols, different types of symbols. And of course, religious practice of every type is infused with symbols. So I think that's an important starting line, is that symbols are absolutely, infused in every aspect of human life. Where do symbols come about specifically in our context of Azadari? I think here we need to think about what we mean by Azadari. And of course, I'm sure the learned panelists will have things to say which can help move the discussion along. But first and foremost, we know that Azadari is associated with this grand, noble performance, and remembrance of the troubles and the sorrows of Imam al-Hussain, salamullahi alayh, and those who were with him at Karbala. So there's expression of grief. And there are particular symbols which have developed over time around that particular religious practice. In and of themselves, as I started with, symbols are a very normal way of human understanding and human communicating. So when it comes to Azadari, these symbols have taken on at various levels and various degrees of meaning. The beautiful thing about the way the human mind works and the diverse way the human minds work, in fact, is people respond to different symbols. And the way people communicate, the way people relate, to the thing which they're seeking to communicate with or relate to varies in accordance with the symbols which they use and the symbols which they develop. So ultimately, we know, without beating around the bush, that the practice of Azadari, as it has developed over centuries, and it has developed over centuries, is diverse. Within that diverse practice, different symbols take on different importance, for different communities. And those symbols, to me, are of value if and when they are a means to communicating the ultimate message which this Azadari is meant to revolve around. And those are the messages which Hussain ibn Ali sought to enliven, in his struggle towards Karbala. And those are the values of godliness and goodliness.
Thank you. Dr. Komail, building on what Dr. Ali has just said to us, how do we understand Azadari in terms of the semantics of the word Azadari and in the context of the broader notion of Tawalla and Tabara or Tawalli and Tabarri?
A very good question, and I think it's good to start with this. I would like to distinguish between the word Azadari and Azakari. Although the word comes from Persian, Urdu sort of language, but when we say Azadari, it means something to preserve, something to live with. That is from the root word azadashtan, which is like, to be in the state and the status of aza, as opposed to azakari, which is to show the aza in terms of outer expression. So the emphasis needs to be on azadari, the very word which our ancestors chosen for this, that you need to be in the stage and the state of grief and sorrow and pain. And once a person is in the state of pain and grief, that is definitely going to be translated in the outer expression as well. But when it comes the opposite way, which is a person indulges in azakari without having that state of aza, that result in something which is just a formalistic sort of religion with a shallow content. When it comes to the context of tawalli and tabarri, the whole discussion of aza, we need to understand that the concept, as Dr. Riza alluded to, throughout the centuries, in different places, in different time periods, people had different notions when it comes to azadari or when it comes to tawalli and tabari. For example, like once upon a time, Sheikh Saduq in the 4th century after Hijrah, in his work, Man La Yahdul Faqih, he mentions, like, may Allah curse those people, those mufawwada who holds the belief and recite Ashhadu Anna Aliyan Waliyullah and so on and so forth in Adhan. So once upon a time, that individual was cursed, but today it has become the part of the Shia identity. So you see, the concept of tawalli and like how we express this tawalli has been fluctuating throughout the centuries, throughout the period. As I just gave you one example, and we could discuss more and more in upcoming question answers.
Thank you. Sheikh Ali, Dr. Kumail mentioned that Azadari is an identity for Shia Islam. Now, this claim is often made, that Shia Islam has two features that distinguish it from Islam general. One is Azadari. Can you shed some light on that? Azadari is an identity for the Shia.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you for having me, inshallah. Inshallah, we'll have a fruitful session together, inshallah. I personally feel that we need to discuss Azadari in the context of the prophetic and the Imam's context. If we see that Aza was a central concept in their opinion, then yes, we can then come and conclude that yes, this is part of the Shia culture and part of the Islamic culture. So I would like to distinguish that have we separated ourselves from the common Muslim body or not because of Aza? The way the Muslims do Aza and the way we have been doing Aza, and really is the Aza we are doing the way it was done by the Prophet and the Imams. And then only we can come and then distinguish that, is this a central part of the Shia identity or not? This is number one. Number two, as the previous learned scholars have mentioned, that this is an evolution going on with time. Okay, so my humble opinion is this, that with time, yes, Azadari might have become a part of Shia culture, but it wasn't the same in the beginning. I normally like giving this example. This example might sound a bit strange, but in the biography of Ayatollah Mar'ashi Najafi, Sayyid Adil Al-Alawi has written this biography. He quotes this incident. For me, it was a bit hard to understand, but wallah, the other panelists can shed their light on. It was on the day of Ashura, and the Aza was going on, and suddenly the time came for Adhan. When the time for adhan came, so the muaddin started reciting adhan. Now, before starting to recite adhan, he told the people and the public that, can you please silence yourselves, at least for the adhan. So Sayyid Adil al-Alawi now mentions, and I'm mentioning it because it's mentioned in this book, and it's like a praise which has been mentioned. Ayatollah Mar'ashi Najafi was sitting aside, and he was there, and he tells the muaddin that Sakit Bosh, okay, shut up, if I can put it that way, that please be silent. Don't tell the muaddin to silence himself and to tell the Azadar to silence themselves. Rather, it's because of the Azah this namaz is there. Okay? Now, is this the same concept we get at the time of the Imams? This is a question I've always asked myself, and I have not reached a conclusion to it myself. So I don't know if it is a Shia identity or not.
Interesting. I would then like to just continue with this question. Sheikh Abu Jafar, what are your thoughts on the claim that Azadari is a feature of Shia Islam to the degree that it forms an identity for the Shia?
I believe, firstly, as Dr. Ali Riza have said, that is Abojani said, that symbolism is a part of life, and we see it in the Quran, we see it in the Sunnah, we see it in the traditions in both sides, whether Sunni or Shias. For example, in Surah Al-A'raf, when you read chapter 7, verse 138, you will see Allah, He said, وَجَوَزْنَا بِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ الْبَحْرَ فَأَتَوْا عَلَى قَوْمٍ يَعْكُفُونَ عَلى أَسْنَامٍ لَهُمْ قالوا يا موسى اجعل لنا إلها كما لهم آلهة قال إنكم قوم تجهلون. So when you read this verse, we see that the people, while they saw other community, they worship their idols, they have their symbols of type of worshiping. They also wanted to have the same. So I believe symbolism and way of life, it is created by community due to the incident or scenarios or historical facts. So if you go again in, let us say, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 248, you see, وَقَالَ لَهُمْ نَبِيُّهُمْ, the verse, إِنَّ آيَةَ مُلْكِهِ أَنْ يَأْتِيَكُمُ التَّابُوتُ فِيهِ سَكِينَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَبَقِيَّةٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ آلَ مُوسَى وَآلُ هَارُونَ تَحْمِلُهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةً لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. It speaks about the kingdom of Bani Israel and Talut and David and others. And the verse speak about Tabut, which is maybe a wooden box. Inside that box, there were they call it an Ark of Covenant. And there is the fact and the Torah, maybe 10 Commandments and Torah and other things that belong to Bani Israel. So preserving the identity is very important in Islamic religion, because Allah mentioned the tabut of the Bani Israel and how it was so important for them in bringing tranquility. And then tahmiluhu al-malaika, even the angels participate in preserving that Ark of Covenant, preserving the identity, preserving the symbol of the religion of Bani Israel. I think we can pay attention on this too. Also, Allah in Surah
Sheikh Abu Jafar,
no.
I need to move this discussion on, so I'll come back to you in a little while. Dr. Bojani, I do need us to clarify this point. The identity of Islam or a Muslim is belief in Tawheed, belief in the Risala of the Prophet Muhammad as a minimum requirement. And that is then the identity of a Muslim. Identity of Shia Islam, is it the belief in Imamat, or is it the belief in addition to Imamat, in addition to that, the belief in Azadari? What do we mean by identity? Just some clarity on this issue.
Sure. So I think before we can give clarity, I think we kind of can further problematize actually these distinctions. We should open them up, because at one level say, okay, what is the identity of the Shia communities? And I think what Sheikh Ali Karmali was asking was what ought to be the identity of the Shia community. Or he's asking, is it the same thing? So I think that, again, we shouldn't beat around the bush. There's no doubt that the Shia communities today are symbolized through their practices of Azadari. Their self-symbolization of Shia communities through practices of Azadari, and they're symbolized by others through their practices of Azadari. So I recall, when I was teaching an introduction to Islam course at the University of Nottingham a few years ago, I took over the course, which had been taught there for maybe 10, 15, 20 years. And they had one lecture for undergraduate students on Shia Islam. Now, how did they start that series of lectures? Yeah, they started it by showing Tatbir and Zanjir. Okay, so this was a 10-week course, undergraduate level, University of Nottingham, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Okay, when it came to their discussion specifically of Shia Islam, okay, they started by showing videos, very, very graphic videos of Zanjir, bloodletting, Tatbir. So there is no doubt that Azadari in various forms are used to symbolize Shiism, and Shias themselves, okay, see Azadari as a symbol of their faith. I don't think we can get away from this. I think the question which, we're maybe starting to explore, and Sheikh Kumail has already asked, okay, saying that, what type of performance is this? What type of use of the symbol is this? He's saying that maybe we need to think about this, a state of grief, not just a performance of grief. Okay, my question is actually, where is that purpose towards these practices? And actually for a useful practice, we are going to think about purpose.
We will be exploring those questions. I'm still not clear, so I'm going to go to Sheikh Kumail. Sheikh Kumail, I'm getting this message now that the onlooker identifies symbolism and Azadari with the group that call themselves Shia. However, in order to be Shia, do you have to believe in the notion of Azadari and be practicing Azadari? Or you can be a Shia and not agree with Azadari, in which case it's not a theological identity of the sect, it's just something that's been associated and Shias are labeled with. Just some clarity on that.
Yeah, strictly theologically speaking, yes. It's not an article of faith per se, Islamic identity, neither is a sort of article of faith as far as Shia identity is concerned. So we don't mean to say, when we say Shia identity, we don't mean to say apart from Adl and Imama, Azadari is one of those elements or articles which needs to be there, added in the distinction or theological like Usuluddin or Furuddin or whatever one might teach or learn in madrasa. So that's not what we mean to say. Dr. Ali Raza had eloquently elaborated on this topic, and I don't want to get into the further detail except one anecdote he mentioned about undergrad student. But I was invited with my Sunni colleague to a gathering in a grammar school for year 6, and they were 10 years old kids. So because they knew I was Shia and my Sunni colleague was following Sunni school of thought, so they were asking questions. So when it came to me, my turn, the same question I was asked about the Tatbir and what is the Tatbir, what is the philosophy behind it, why do they do this? And it's difficult to go and defend it or reject it, because if you start defending it, then there are scholars who reject it, and if you start rejecting it, there are scholars who try to defend it. So precisely when we say Shia identity, we don't mean in that strict theological sense. Rather, it's something we started our discussion with symbolism.
So therefore, it came and developed historically, and it's more to do with the perceptions of the followers of Imam Hussein about themselves and the relationship with Imam Hussein, and it's to do with how the onlooker perceives the people who are the followers of the Imams.
Sheikh, let me complete with one sentence which I've started with. The current state in which we are, it's more of Azakari as opposed to Azadari, which Aima alayhi salatu wasalam had always asked us to be in that state.
Azakar
Yeah.
or Azadar.
My understanding is like Imams have advocated for the concept of Azadari. What we currently are doing is something demonstrating and more into Azakari.
So basically, let me just explain the distinction that Dr. Komail is making, because then that will lead us into the next question, that the Imams asked us to adhere internally and maybe communally to the message of Imam Hussein and Imams before and subsequent Imam Hussein through lovingly tending to them. As opposed to that, we are making a show of that personal relationship at an individual and communal level, if I've just put that together properly now. So I want to ask now, if Azadari is such a prominent feature of the Shia madhab, then the question comes, well, what are its theological bases? What is the justification for Azadari and the subsequent show of expressions of love to the Imam? Sheikh Ali Karmani.
Okay, can I just allude to the previous point and then come to this point which you're making? What I feel is, as Sheikh Kumail mentioned, that we have become Azakar. That's a beautiful word. I never knew that that's what the meaning is. There was a workbook shared in Muharram for some of the young ones in one of the communities. So a friend of mine downloaded the document, and then he was like, let me go through this document and search for the word Allah in the document, because the core message of our deen is Allah and Tawheed. But unfortunately, what has happened with our aza and with our rituals is that the main God centricity, the main focus has been lost in the process, and we are focused somewhere else now. Okay, that's the message I was trying to give. I remember listening to Sheikh Hubbullah when the pandemic happened, and Sheikh Hubbullah, when he was talking about Corona, one of the things he mentioned was that the Shias are now undergoing a turmoil when it comes to this pandemic has brought in a revision of some thoughts now. Okay, is that all what we are teaching, all what we have been talking about, are they part and parcel of our faith or not? And I guess it'll answer the second question, inshallah, that when he discusses, one of the things which happened in the early pandemic in Iran and Iraq was that the harams were closed, the shrines were closed. And the other thing which happened was that there was disinfection of the shrines. So Sheikh Hubbullah, in his talk, he questions this concept. He says the Shia started questioning themselves, is that all these years we have been told that these imams cure us and are a reason for our shifa. And suddenly now these imams are supposed to be disinfected, number one. And number two, in the time when we are in the most problematic state, the imams cannot help us. So now, is it time that we revisit what we have told the people about the imams? So I would say the same about Aza also. Is it that we have, if I can put the word rightly, have we overemphasized on this issue during time And I come back to my first point, that were the Imams and the Prophets overemphasizing on this point the way we have emphasized? I don't know. For me, again, these are question marks. I will
make it easier for you. Allow me. So we have hadith, man baka wabka tabaka.
Yes.
We have hadith that even Allah comes down from Arsh to do the ziyarah of Hussein ibn Ali. We have a hadith that walking to Imam Hussein, 1 million Hajj and Umrah and Jihad rewards are given to you for every step that you take. Are these hadith the origin for Azadari? Were they encouraging it? And is this the source for its legitimacy?
If I can put it that way, that with the Shia culture, yes. For example, taking into point the yesterday's discussion, if you notice, some of the scholars were really pointing out to a book like Kamil al-Ziyarat. Okay, a book like Kamil al-Ziyarat has been used for the legitimacy of a lot of the rituals we are doing today. But the book, again, itself needs to be scrutinized more before we take up our theological concepts from that book. So personally, again, if you were to ask me, I would say that, yes, the Shia culture has extracted that from these kind of ahadith. But really, is that what the Imams and the Prophet wanted? This is the question which we need to ask, inshallah.
I'm going to move to Sheikh Abu Ja'far. Obviously, we need to also scrutinize whether these hadith are authentic in the first instance. That debate has to be had. In any case, Sheikh Abu Ja'far, one is the question of the authenticity of the practice of Azadari. The other one is it being encouraged by the Imams. So I know the Shias normally source the permissibility of it through the Quran. Do we have any text that encourages it?
First of all, I believe that most of the riwayah that spoke about the fadail of Ziyarah of Hussein and has been exaggerated. It is taken from what we call them ghulat. And the riwayah that speak about Azadari, they are there, which are more authentic. And the importance of ziyarah, it is well stated in those authentic riwayah. I think in Surah Yusuf, there is kind of evidence which speak about Azadari. But this Azadari spoken by the Quran, it is Azadari that comes from love, passionately, that comes automatically from the heart of someone whom you love. For example, when the news reached Yaqub alayhi salam about Yusuf and what has happened to him, the brothers, they say, Waja'u, Quran says, Waja'u ala qamisihi bidamin kadib. They put the blood, false blood on those, clothes of Yusuf. But Yaqub, he said, Qala bal sawwalat lakum anfusukum amra. Fasabrun jamil. He said that my sabr will be jamil, very good sabr. But when we look at that sabr in the Holy Quran, we see it was not like how he said. Firstly, in Surah Yusuf, verse 86, he said, Qala innama ashku bathi wa huzni ila Allah. وَأَعْلَمْ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. This is the person that he knows from Allah what other people they do not know. He say, أَشْكُ بَثِّي وَحُزْنِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. He sent his huzn to Allah. And then he said, فَصَبْرٌ جَمِيل. My sabr will be jamil. We are expecting that this sabr should not have any bad impact to him. But when we look at the surah itself, it is speak contrary. In the verse, let us say 84 of Surah Yusuf, it says, وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَ عَلَى يُوسُف. Like how we say, Wa Hussein. يا أسف على يوسف وبيضت عيناه من الحزن فهو كظيم. So in a process of crying, in a process of being, let us say, sorrow and sad, he lost his eyes. So this, it has impact, bad impact of huzn from a prophet. So also, there is also a cure. When you find yourself, you are in the presence of the one that you love. Quran says, فَلَمَّا أَنْجَاءَ الْبَشِيرُ, when the person came to give a good tidings to Yaqub, أَلْقَاهُ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ, he threw the garment of Yusuf, فَارْتَدَّ بَصِيرًا, on the face of Yaqub, فَارْتَدَّ بَصِيرًا, he became again seeing. He was cured from that kind of blindness. So we see here the effect of the sadness, which comes from the heart, and we see Azadari in the life of Yaqub alayhi salam, but this came automatically.
Thank you, Sheikh Abu Jafar.
Somewhere in the street to show your house to everybody. It was inside love that it created sadness from the Prophet. Yeah.
Thank you, Sheikh Abu Jafar. Dr. Ali Raza. Look, one is general permissibility, ibaha, that we are allowed to do this, yes? And we can source it from the maxims of the jurisprudential laws that we have. We can source it, as Sheikh Abu Jafar has done, from the verses of the Quran. That's just the permissibility. One is actively encouraging upholding of Azadari, commemoration of Hussein ibn Ali, and allowing it to evolve into a variety of expressions. When we look at our Sunni brothers, they normally quote a hadith that grief is for 3 days and after that leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many of them would quote that as a counter argument. In face of that argument, I'm asking, do we have any solid arguments that encourage the practice of Azadari or even Azakari, as Sheikh Komail has described?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously there's specific evidences which are cited, the likes of the hadith which you mentioned, okay, praising the remembrance of Imam Hussein, crying for Imam Hussein, even pretending to cry for Imam Hussein. And then there's more general evidences, not for permissibility, more general evidences which are used, okay, as a basis to encourage the enlivening of the remembrance of Imam Hussein. So you will find many scholars referring to this, what we're calling Azadari as, Ihya Sha'air al-Husayniyah, for example, enlivening, the signs thereof Imam al-Hussein. And people would position this, at least some scholars would position this widely, as being an instance of, magnifying or glorifying the Sha'air Allah, which of course there are specific verses in the Quran which mention. So for example, Surah Al-Hajj, وَمَن يُعَذِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Various other verses of Surah Al-Hajj which talk about this category of Sha'air Allah. Now from there, many Shia scholars have considered that Hussein ibn Ali himself is one of these symbols of God. The remembrance of Imam Hussein, enlivening, the remembrance of Imam Hussein, is tantamount to enlivening these symbols of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, there is differences of opinion, even amongst the Shia scholars about the suitability of this. Okay, so there is a debate here. Now, is the Sha'air Allah, those things which all Muslims would agree, are things which, these are symbols. Okay, these are symbols which have been identified by the Quran as being worthy of being glorified. Now, there's a discussion amongst the ulama, are these Sha'air tawqifiyah? So are these Sha'air things which are scripture bound? So something which is a Sha'air, which must be glorified, and actually if you can't glorify this, if you can't respect it to the point one may have to leave their town and do hijrah. It's a debate actually which comes up across the abwab of fiqh. Actually, if you can't magnify, or you can't do your diligence towards the maintaining the Sha'air of Islam, okay, you may actually have to leave your hometown. So are these elements which are considered to be of such important symbolic value, within Islam, are they things which have been specified by texts? Or are they open to include things like the remembrance of Hussain ibn Ali? We then have a second level of discussion, okay, where we see some people, and it follows from an example Sheikh Kumail gave earlier on, is that can we then talk about, and scholars have started talking about, sha'airul iman. Okay, so symbols, particularly of the Shia faith. Now, interestingly, Sayyid Mohsin al-Hakim had mentioned in Mustamsik al-Urwa that the very third shahada of the azan, which Sheikh Kumal mentioned earlier on, was, and refuted as being permissible at the time of Sheikh Suduq, he is describing now, in the 20th century as being sha'airul iman. Okay, so we see a fluctuation in these symbols, and that many scholars rooting the importance of magnifying these symbols because of the movement in time, okay, because of the shifts in culture and because of the shifts in societies, under general evidences within the Quran, which are ultimately about reviving the message of God. So you see, other scholars would say, okay, no, actually the remembrance of Hussein, this is part of Nurullah. Okay, and the Quran explicitly calls us to glorify the light of God. So if Hussein ibn Ali, okay, is, this beautiful ray of light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay, then remembrance of Hussein ibn Ali, enlivening his message, okay, through various symbolic practices, are deemed not only permissible, but encouraged. So that gives a sense of the impetus behind it.
Okay, so I'm still after concrete evidence, which I'm not finding here. So far, I haven't. Now, Sheikh Kumail, I'm going to just ask you briefly now to respond to this, again, to add to this, but I'm going to just elaborate a bit more on this before we move on. It seems that nobody is citing credible evidence in which the Imams have encouraged upholding of the Azadari of Hussain ibn Ali. The text from later Imams was that I saw my father in a state of grief from 1st of Muharram till the 10th of Muharram, on the day of Ashura, his grief would know no end. Now, what I'm asking here is, do we have concrete evidences that state, that uphold ceremonies of Azadari, be Azadar, beyond the description of how the Imam in his own self was? Or is it more rationally based that we knew that the message of Hussein was contingent to upholding his ceremonial remembrance? Yes, Dr. Kumail.
Yeah, Sheikh, I would like to encourage all of us to come out from that rigid, narrow fiqhi understanding. As far as that fiqhi understanding, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So as far as the fiqhi understanding is concerned, yeah, for sure, everything is subject to discussion, the particular practices, particular expressions of Azadari, like being strictly mustahab or not. Fuqaha themselves are not committed. Those fuqaha who would argue for istihbab of certain practices, they are not committed to their own istihbab and recommendation as far as in a strict legal sense is concerned. For example, some of the ziyarat, if you ask to a particular faqih, he would say like, yeah, it's mustahab. But then if it's mustahab, and if a person would do ghusl before it, can I be exempted from wudu followed after the ghusl which you stated mustahab? They would say, no, well, it is mustahab, but not that kind of mustahab which would allow you to be exempted from performing wudu. So here you see now they use istihbab in different terms. In a strictly fiqhi legal sense, I won't find any sort of evidence to suggest the istihbab per se for different practices currently we people do. But in a general sense, because of, as I mentioned, because it is turned out to be a Shia identity in a more general sense, whether you would like to call it Ibaha or like, as some scholars would call it Istihbab, they would have different terms and jargons for using and verifying certain things. So I don't see that there needs to be an emphasis that everyone has to do all the aspects of Azadari. Even like on the day of Ashura, if a person indulges in some sort of working, he's not committing any sin. He's not doing any sort of haram thing. Rather, it's turned to be a sort of Shi expression, which, as I termed it, like, Shi identity. So you're going against a Shi identity, not like a religious identity. And as we know, Sunni identity, Shi identity, these are like constructed identities which has been developed over centuries. And then everyone is free to stick to whichever identity a person thinks. But going back to the original essence of Islam, all these things could be, boiled down to belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Yawmul Ma'ad.
So Azadari is very potent. It's very effective. I think we don't even need text-based evidences. Rational obligation in terms of upholding a practice that draws us near to God and to the ethos of the Blessed Prophet and Imam Hussain, Islah fi ummat jaddi, bettering ourselves morally, spiritually, it's more than enough. What I suppose I want to respond to the people who ask, why do you people perform Azadari? We say, well, look, it's a rational obligation for us. It serves the purpose that the prayer and Hajj and Zakat are trying to serve anyway. So there is something concrete that it is based on. It's a rational obligation. We, in our sort of rational understanding of how to bring people closer to God, feel Azadari is very potent. Dr. Ali, please quickly, before I move on to the next set of questions.
I think that's a beautiful justification, but it only works. It only works if it's purpose orientated.
Yes, we are coming to the purpose.
So that is very, very important, okay? And
yes,
so obviously that's where I started with, actually. You've taken us down the line. And this is why I started with saying symbols have value when they move us towards something, towards a particular objective.
We are getting there slowly. The train is still on the track.
Okay, so if I could just say one thing about a discussion which went previously.
Okay.
So, and which I didn't have the opportunity to complete. So I said that, look, this practice, various expressions of love for Imam al-Hussein, remembrance of Imam al-Hussein, have become symbolic of Shi'ism, right? Is this how the Imams themselves wished for Shias to be symbolized in the broader community? Have we dealt with that yet, or can I contribute to this now?
We're going to come to it in just a little while. Right. In the context of a broader sort of a question. Very, very quickly, I need Sheikh Ali Karmali to very quickly take us through the evolutionary stages of Azadari. So we were mourning on the day of Ashura, then 3 days before Ashura, then 10 days. Then we have the introduction of Latam, then Tatbir, then Blade. We have walking on fire. We have Zuljana, the replica of the horse of Imam Hussein. We have Alam. We have the palm of Abbas Salamullah alayh. Can you just take us through how these things have evolved generally?
Okay. In my small research which I've done, what I found out that I'm quoting from Maqtal Jami', the 8 scholars who have done a research on, this is a beautiful book for those who understand Persian. Their conclusion is this, that there were only 2 rituals which were there at the time of the Prophet and the Imams. And this is why I kept on questioning that can we further it? And the way Dr. Ali Raza said that, is it tawqifi or not? This is a discussion which needs to be done with scholars a bit openly. So in my small research, I found out that the only 2 rituals which were there at the time of the Imams, so I'll quote, he says that Dar Asr Imaman Shi'e Shakl Azadari Bara Imam Hussein Mahdud bi Marsi Surai Giristan wa Giryandan Bud. So their research tells us that there were only 2 rituals. One was Marthia, poetry, which we see the Imams encouraging it with some of the poets. And the whole process which we were talking about, the crying and making others cry. Now, just a point here, the tabaka, which inshallah, I don't know if we will be discussing it further, but I would love to hear from the panelists that is the tabaka also part of the ritual which was there at the time of the Imam or not? This is a question mark. There's another researcher which I was reading. There's a good thesis in English called Shia Rituals, written by Rashid al-Badri. He concludes a third ritual, and he says that these were established in the formative period of Shia. Okay, so apart from the two, ziyarah comes as a third one. Apart from this, we don't get anything concrete at the time of the Imams. Further than that, everything now goes into the different levels and different histories. What I found interesting was that some scholars like Sheikh Mahdi Shamsuddin, he tries to broaden the different stages of Aza to even, so he takes the period, he divides Aza into 3 periods. The first period, which was interesting for me, was that he divides it from Ashura, 61 AH, all the way towards the Mongols, towards the 6th and 7th century. Now, this is a bit of hard then to get what actually the Imams did and what the Prophet did. But Maktal Jami and the scholars, they have done a beautiful research. What they've done is that they've divided the Aza according to the periods. So what was there at the time of the Imams, and then what was there at the time of the Buid dynasty, and then later the Safavid and the Qajars. And so I don't know if I can go into all the details.
I will make it easy for you.
Ji.
Hitting the blade on the head, cutting the bodies, where did that come from?
Okay, so in my research, and there's a beautiful article by Sheikh Bahamanpur also on this, why we should ban zanjir and tatbir in our centers. The research is very clear that blades and zanjir and padlocks and metals and all came in during the Safavid period. The interesting part only to notice is this, that did it come from a non-Muslim ritual and came into Islam? Or no, it was the Safavids doing it as part of their army and as part of the army celebrations on the day of Ashura. And then slowly during the Qajars, where we see Mullah Darbandi coming in, where he enforced this issue of pain. And that is why you see the spread of bloods and zanjir and qama and everywhere going into different cities and different cultures.
Because in the interest of time, I'm going to actually stop that particular discussion there. We need to move on. In terms of the perceptions of others, of Shia Islam through the practice of symbolism, Azadari, how far should we curtail our freedom of expression due to the negative perceptions that the onlooker have about us? So for example, when we go and touch the Janah, we have the alam and we kiss the alam, for example. Now some say that what difference is there between kissing the alam and praying to the alam or through the alam, and our Hindu sort of brothers going to the statue or the idol, praying to or through the idol and kissing the idol? Should their perception of us and our Azadari and symbolism curtail our freedom of expression? Dr. Bojani now. Sorry.
Yes. Okay. So I think yes and no. At the same time, we have to say, okay, does bow, for the uninformed observer, should we always shift for the uninformed observer, or do we need to think about, a sort of shared level of understanding? Because for the uninformed observer, bowing before the Kaaba looks like idolatry. There's no difference for the uninformed observer who knows nothing of the Muslim notion of Tawheed, an absolute commitment to one God who is boundless, timeless, spaceless. When they see the rituals of Hajj, okay, they don't see much difference between this and Hindu rituals. So does it mean, because of the uninformed observers, not having a sense of the purpose of these rituals, doesn't mean we should change the Hajj? right? So I think we have to be careful to not make these judgments always based on the uninformed observer. But does perception matter? Okay, this is where I would say yes. Okay, when it comes to the symbols which we aspire towards, okay, and which we seek to enliven. So if we take that tone, which you kind of helped us with, Sheikh Arif, you know, to say that, okay, look, these practices are meant to be expressions of love, you know, towards the remembrance of Imam Hussain, yeah, towards embodying and uplifting the very spirit of Islam itself, then we have to look towards the objective which these things are taking us towards. And I think there the symbolic value of our practice has become very, very important. And it seems to me that when we look at the words of the Imams, okay, themselves, when they were talking to their Shias and saying to them, how should you be perceived by others? You know, what should be your symbolic value in society? It wasn't in terms of their remembrance of Hussein ibn Ali. Okay, so they were being encouraged to be symbols of those who are truthful, of those who are committed to God, of those who are good neighbors, of those who are the most trustworthy of people. You know, and we find this in our hadith, you know, in Al-Kafi attributed to Imam Sadiq on a number of occasions. We find it in the Tuhfa al-Uqul attributed to Al-Hasan al-Askari, salamullahi alayhim. You know, that saying, this is then my Shia. This is what Muhammad brought. If you are truthful in your word, if you are trustworthy, if you visit the sick of others, i.e. non-Shias, if Shias are participating within the community, you know, they're visiting the graveyards of others, they're participating others.
I understand what you're saying, but the question is how much of our practices ought to be curtailed due to the negative perception of the onlooker. Now, I'm going to shift that question. Thank you for your contribution, Sheikh Kumail. When the people look at the Shias drawing blood, they do say these are barbaric people. Now the Shias in response, they say, well, the Hindus do the same thing, the Christians do the same thing. So they justify themselves through the practice of other cultures and faith groups. What I'm asking here is that should we not be adhering to best practice as demonstrated by the Blessed Prophet and the Imams themselves?
Of course, and for that reason, personally, I find it difficult to understand or justify certain ritualistic practices and various forms of expression as far as Azadari is concerned. Coming back to the same distinction of the difference between Azadari and Azakari, if the purpose has been diluted to Azakari, then, you know, a person is not mindful about like what other people are perceiving. So a basic thumb rule for me is like, you know, every year after Muharram and Safar, if I turn to be a good individual, if I get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I start getting in proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following the footsteps of Imam Hussain, then, you know, why not? I need to continue doing it. I mean, like, you know, continue having the feeling of Azza. But if these practices and rituals are just like, you know, show off and it's not translating into the ahadith which Dr. Riza alluded to, that Imam would say, Hada Ja'afariyun, or Imams would say, Kunu lana dhaynan wa la takunu alayna shaynan. So at times, some of our ritualistic practices are like, you know, having a shame, bringing a bad name, not only for non-Muslims, but our own fellow Muslim brothers and sisters. And the worst part is like, you know, some of scholars would either refuse to reject it or they might stay silent for various justification they might have. So the problem comes like, you know, from the scholarly fraternity. Unless they come together with a single voice, things would not change.
I just want to add something very, very quickly. And if one of you wants to make a very quick comment, and we can go to the final discussion here. We find suspension of normal life for 2 months and a few days until Eid Zahra. People don't purchase houses, don't embark on new business ventures, don't get married. Now, isn't that restrictive and unnecessary?
Yes, I believe it is actually. If you just want a quick response to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it is unnecessary. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
that is not coming, Sheikh Arif, that's not coming from the riwayat or like, narrations. That is something very much tied to certain rituals in certain regions, and it's not across the Shi'i sort of like, anti-Shi'i community as well.
But tell me this, my learned brothers, and if sister is there, hasn't it gotten out of control? When the Imams were just saddened by the sacrifice of Hussein, they wanted us to remember Imam Hussein in order to understand the distinction between truth and falsehood. Haven't we just taken it to the next level and it's spiraled out of control? Every year there are new introductions and innovations, and we religiously have to uphold them. We don't get married, we don't buy businesses, we have to wear black clothes, we can't rejoice. And in addition, all the variations of matam, of beating ourselves, of cutting ourselves, of new horses, of black and green colors. I think the scholars need to intervene here and say something. If I could just have some quick responses to this before we go to a final discussion.
My quick response is, Sheikh, yes, it has certainly got out of hand to the extent that scholars, despite the fact they would say in their private circles, but they would refuse to come at open in public. That shows the level of the severity of the matter and how much it has gone out of control.
Abu Jafar, you wanted to come in, Abu Jafar?
I think, we have allowed the scholars to do what they want, while we know that certain elements or certain things, matters, should be prohibited or should be stopped. I don't know why we fear whom, I don't know. Because if the hadith say that la takun shaynan lana, and we continue to ignore the riwayah sahih of the imams, I don't know what we are doing with our Shia Islam.
Thank you, Sheikh Abu Jafar. Sheikh Ali Karmali, very quickly.
Can I quote this incident if I have time? Just to show that I don't know if it's easy the way we are portraying it here. Shaykh Mutahari quotes this incident of his teacher, Ayatollah Burjardi, that he says when Sayyid Burjardi became a marja, there was a particular practice which was happening in Iran, and he was told that this is happening, and he said this is wrong. So he called everybody, and he said, can I have all the members of the Hayat and all? And he tells them, now notice, this is what, he takes a confession that, are you all my muqallids? And they all agree, we are your muqallids. So then he turns back to all the people there and tells them that, then I say that this particular ritual is haram from today. What the response was is what is important for me, is that the people turned back very clearly in the same meeting. This is Shaykh Mutahari quoting in his Hamas Husseini, that they told him that, Agha, we will be your muqallid for the whole year, but these 3-4 days allow us not to do your taqleed. Okay? So what I'm seeing is there's a kind of the way Sheikh Kumail is portraying that the scholars now have come to a level that they don't want to go public in speaking such things, because when they even tell their muqallideen in the private that this is not allowed, it seems like it's bouncing back. So they've decided to let it go and say, okay, whatever happens, inshallah, will happen, and we don't cause further confusion.
Dr. Ali,
yeah. Okay. So quickly, I think you're asking for a quick response.
Yeah.
But it has to be balanced, because there's no doubt that these practices are the way, our children, ourselves, we learn these teachings of justice, of ethics, of loyalty. Actually, these are cultural vehicles for us to learn values. There's no doubt about it, right? So, we can't deny that, right? That these are the drip effects. On the flip side of it, whenever these practices become an end instead of a means to those values and ultimate towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then absolutely they have gone too far. And there's no denying, as the other panelists have said, in many, many instances they've gone too far. Unfortunately, these are often a matters of, unless we start looking at perceptions, okay, these are often internal matters. And as soon as you open up the basis for these as being approach to God, and the rational obligation that you perceived, then it means that it gives license, and hence we have to introduce overarching principles which help people rather than adding to a polarization of discourse. Look, actually, our communities rely upon these months for their basic ethical, spiritual discourse. There's no denying that, right? The problem is that needs to, in some cases, that has become self-serving instead of God-serving. And I believe we have to help redirect it towards God-serving practices.
So thank you for that. And you actually, in a nutshell, said it all. We've run out of time, but there is one pressing issue we need to deal with, which we need to get through in the next 5 minutes. What do we perceive as the objective of Azadari? This is something that Dr. Bhojani was going on about from the very first time he contributed. And that's the last thing on our agenda. So now, if the objective is to convey the message of Imam Hussain to the onlooker, then surely the expression of Azadari has to be conducive to the understanding of the onlooker. If the objective is to revive the love of Hussain ibn Ali and through him to embody those values of a God-centered person, then we have a free hand at what and how we want to remember Imam Hussain. Does that therefore then bring us to this notion that Azadari needs to be understood at two levels, as a private practice in a private space and a public practice in a public sphere? Can I have your thoughts very, very quickly on that? So that in London, it would make no sense to take out a horse with processions in the streets of London and beating ourselves. Yeah, but that has its own place within the four walls of a mosque or the Hussainia. But outside, maybe like Who is Hussein launches a campaign of giving water and leaflets and talking, holding seminars and discussion groups over values that Imam Hussain aspired to. Your quick thoughts on that, and we will finish. Dr. Bhojani, we'll start with you since you're already there.
Okay, I'm sorry. Right. So I think that the objectives are multiple. Okay, at any one time, and always have been. Okay, so at one level, they're intercessionary. Okay, so some people are participating in these rituals for their own sake, for the pursuit of blessings, for the pursuit of forgiveness. Okay, yeah, and maybe other objectives which are unbeknown to us. At the other level, there are those who are seeking to use these practices towards those basic values which Hussain ibn Ali epitomized, which the Prophet epitomized, which we see as central to Islam, and basic human dignity. So of course, we can say, and I've already said it, that any of those practices which aren't helping us move in that direction are problematic, all right, and deserve to be, okay, and consistently and continuously, reviewed in that spirit of reform which Hussain ibn Ali himself stood for. The problem is, Sheikh, is that I don't believe that we can have a very straightforward private-public distinction anymore in this world. The nature of the world today is that what somebody does in a private gathering, in a marquee in Birmingham, okay, is global tomorrow. And actually, this is one of the big challenges, not just of Shia Islam, actually, but of the current world in which we live, which actually is actually suppresses individual expressions, okay, which may not fit the taste of everybody, and this is a major challenge, actually.
Dr. Bhojani, thank you so much. We are joined by Sister Berak Hussain from Toronto, and these are the final minutes in which you have joined, Sister. So I'll put this particular question to you, and with your answer or response, we will conclude the session. We are talking about Azadari as a means for exporting the message of Hussain ibn Ali to the wider audience. Given that, we are asking ourselves, should Azadari be modeled in any given region in accordance with their perception and understanding, and then the message of Hussain should be conveyed accordingly in a way that is conducive to their understanding?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In his name I begin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sorry, I had just finished up my workday and joined in as soon as I can. And in regards to the topic and what we were talking about in symbolism and majalis aza and whatnot, I can only contribute to this discussion, as I missed the beginning of it, from the psychotherapeutic point of view and the psychological point of view in terms of what symbolism means to us. And when we take a look at that from a Carl Jung point of view, who was one of the founders of analytical psychology and looked at the works of literature, philosophy, religious studies, and psychiatry and anthropology, he used concepts such as the archetype. And so it's a concept that denotes universal images and recurring mental images or themes. And then we also, from Carl Jung, we take a look at persona, and when I take that a bit further in terms of how would we apply these concepts to what we were discussing today, in terms of the metaphors, in terms of the symbols that we can connect with. So from a psychotherapeutic point of view, in terms of a clinical perspective, in terms of how we would work with a client, let's say, with symbols that are important to them, especially things that come from the unconscious for them, how would they apply these concepts into real life? Well, I think it's a very personal thing, right? So I'm just trying to tie it in before I jump into the answer from my background. And so when we take a look at this, it is about the metaphor. It is about the storytelling, right? And the symbols, the physical symbols that we see from the messages, from the story and the history of Karbala, whether it is the water bag of Al-Abbas alayhi salam, whether it is the abaya that we see or that we envision the Sayyidah Zainab wears, whether it's the burning of the tents, whether it's Kaf al-Abbas. So all of these different physical symbols can manifest themselves in the storytelling that we can make a personal connection with. So in the West, how do we, sorry, if you could just repeat your question again so I could tie it all in, Sheikhna?
So the question is that if Azadari is a means of conveying the message of Hussein ibn Ali to the onlooker, to the broader community, then should it not be in a way that is appreciated by the onlooker?
And so when we come to this concept of the storytelling and how do we convey that to the onlooker and somebody who is not of our faith, we can use these concepts that people can understand when it comes to, let's say, Western psychology. Again, I'm speaking from my perspective here of how I would present this, let's say, to my boss. Let's say, why am I wearing black? Every year, people in my office know, for example, that I wear black during a certain time of year for a solid 2 months or throughout the year. That color, that symbol of black for them denotes grief. They connect with that idea. They now ask me, oh, it's that time of year for you again. This year I'm not going, I'm stuck here. But we're working virtually, so they're not really into it. I'm gonna have to tell them. So the onlooker, for example, when they see the black, they'll connect with that mourning, grief. I also connected when discussing the ideas of the storytelling or the metaphors of a symbol that's important to us. For example, here in Canada, we have November 11th as Remembrance Day. And when we are able to talk about Remembrance Day the same way, or rather talk about Karbala in the way that we can talk about Remembrance Day, then people have that linkage of the story. It is the fight and standing up against tyranny, for justice. These are universal themes that we all connect with at the human level. And so when you describe and talk about Karbala in this way, I would say people in the West connect and understand that. They can link it. So then when they see us wearing the black, when they see us taking time off to remember it, these are things that they do as well in remembrance for their people who stood up against evil and injustice. So, and also just quickly, a few years ago, I attended a mental health conference from our Aboriginal community here in Ottawa. By the way, I'm from Ottawa, not Toronto, but we're in the same province. And this was a wonderful 3-day conference where you had elders in the community talking about mental health from such a different angle, from a spiritual Aboriginal perspective that, subhanAllah, as a Muslim, I was able to connect with so deeply. One of the things that struck out for me in terms of how we can convey that Azadari and to the onlooker is, again, the idea of storytelling. In the Aboriginal culture, there is a high regard for water. and nature. And they have different rituals for different seasons and for different means of asking for things. So for example, how we do nadhr, they have something similar to that. They would have specific rituals in regards to asking for something from the Creator. And one of the stories that really struck me was a similar story to Karbala. And I'll quickly just wrap up with that in terms of what we're discussing, in the sense that there were tribes that were in war against each other. And it was the women who carried on the message of the story so that it would not be repeated in the future. This struck me deeply, of course, and we can all understand the connection here. It was the storytelling of the women of Karbala that revived the message of Imam al-Hussein and carried it on till today to how we are honoring the Imam.
I will have to stop you there. Thank you so much for that wonderful contribution. We have to wrap up. Azadari definitely is a part of human need of relating to the one that we love, expressing that belonging, imbibing and embodying the values of the ones that we love, expressing it to the onlooker. However, we have a certain problem that due to the lack of intervention from the ulama, it is spiraling out of control, and maybe the central message of Imam Hussein is being lost, not only to the onlooker, but the person who is involved in Azadari as well. Maybe we need to think about spreading the message of Imam Hussein through the platform of Azadari by connecting to the broader community through shared symbols, shared values. So for example, with Christians, we can engage with them on the basis of the sacrifice of Jesus, salamullah alayhi. With the non-faith community, through the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, for example, or Nelson Mandela, who stood for justice and freedom and liberty and so on and so forth. Maybe we can think along those lines, in which case we can then use Imam Hussein and Azadari for the force of humanity as a whole. Join us tomorrow for the discussion on post-Karbala arbaeen, where we will be joined by Sheikh Dr. Kumail Rajani, Dr. Amina In-laws, Sheikh Ali Karmali, and Dr. Muhammad Fatimi. Thank you all very, very much. God bless you all.